Hello everyone. Wish you a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore the moment Mrs. Huyen finally calls Diep my daughter, and why a single message on James' phone threatens to shatter that peace. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The morning moved slowly, like it didn't want to disturb anything. In Diep's small home, the air smelled of rice porridge and ginger. The window was half open, letting in a soft breeze and the sound of a street waking up. In the next room, little Nee slept curled on her side, one hand under her cheek, trusting, unaware of the storms adults tried to hide. Diep stirred the pot in small circles, eyes drifting toward the doorway. Behind her, Jame tightened a loose screw under the dining table. He didn't talk much while he worked. He just stayed close, like his presence could be a wall around this home. Diep glanced back. "You're going to ruin your shirt." "It's just a shirt," Jame said. "It's the one I ironed." That made him smile. "I'll wash it." Then the doorbell rang. Diep froze for a heartbeat. James' shoulders tightened, the old instinct waking up in him. He moved to the door. "Stay," he told her gently. She followed anyway, 2 steps behind. When Jame opened the door, Mrs. Huyen stood in the hallway. No sharp perfume, no cold inspection. Just a simple blouse, a calm face, and a small wooden box in her hands. Old, dark edges worn smooth by time. "Mom?" Jame whispered. Mrs. Huyen's gaze moved past him to Diep. Diep felt the familiar tension rise in her chest. Good morning," Mrs. Huyen said. "Good morning, Mrs. Huyen," Diep replied. "May I come in?" "Of course," Jame said, stepping aside. Inside, Mrs. Huyen placed the box on the table as if it carried a heartbeat. Diep set out 3 bowls of porridge. The clink of ceramic sounded too loud. "You didn't call," Jame said. "If I called, I might not have come," Mrs. Huyen answered. She looked around at the small room, the folded blanket, the table Jame had just fixed. "I used to believe a home was measured by size," she said. "Rooms, money. And now?" Jame asked. "Now I see it's measured by who still waits for you when you come back exhausted." James' gaze dropped. Diep's hands tightened around her spoon. Mrs. Huyen continued, slow and clear. "You grew up in noise, Jame. Meetings, arguments. Your father's footsteps always sounded like he was chasing something. At the name Mr. Fat," James' jaw set. "I watched you learn to be quiet," she said. "Not because you were calm, because you were trying not to make the storm worse." James swallowed. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because I'm tired of being late," Mrs. Huyen said. From the next room, Nai shifted in her sleep, a soft murmur. Mrs. Huyen's eyes flicked toward the bedroom. "She's sleeping?" Diep nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Huyen paused. "She calls you Uncle Jame?" "Sometimes," Jame admitted, almost embarrassed. Diep added, "She asks when he'll come back, even when he just left." "Children know where safety is," Mrs. Huyen said. Then her tone turned careful. "Mr. Fat asked me something last night." Jame leaned forward. "About me?" "He asked if I was ready to bring you back to your senses," she said. "I told him I won't be used as a knife." Jame stared, as if the past couldn't fit this new sentence. Mrs. Huyen opened the wooden box. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, lay a thin gold bracelet with a small engraved charm. Diep's breath caught. "Mrs. Huyen, I can't—" "You can," Mrs. Huyen said, firm but gentle. "Because I'm giving it." James' voice broke. "Mom, that's our families." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." Mrs. Huyen looked at Diep. "I was hard on you. Not because you deserved it, but because I was afraid. I feared you would be hurt by our world, and I feared Jame would be hurt because he loves too deeply. Diep's eyes glistened. I'm not perfect. I'm not asking for perfect, Mrs. Huyen replied. I'm asking for true. She took Diep's hand and placed the bracelet into her palm. Then she said the word Diep never expected. My daughter. The room went still. Jame blinked hard, but a tear slipped anyway. Diep bowed her head, crying quietly, the way someone cries when a long war finally pauses. Wear it when you're ready, Mrs. Huyen whispered. Not for show, for strength. James' voice was low. Thank you, Mom. Mrs. Huyen held his gaze. Don't thank me yet. She leaned in, sharper now, focused. If Mr. Fat pushes again, you cannot answer with fire. He won't stop, James said. I know, Mrs. Huyen replied, so you must be smarter than his anger. James' phone buzzed on the table. His eyes dropped to the screen. His face changed. Not dramatic, just the color draining away. Diep noticed instantly. What is it? Nothing, James said too fast. Work. He stood. I'll take it outside. He stepped onto the small balcony and closed the door behind him. On the screen was a photo of their home, taken from across the street. Under it, one sentence. Tonight, choose. James' breath turned cold. He deleted the notification with one swipe, like erasing it could erase the danger. Then he came back inside, voice steady by force. Sorry, he said. Just a client. Diep studied him. Your hands are cold. The balcony wind, he lied gently. Mrs. Huyen stood, already reading the air. I should go. You just arrived, Diep said. That's why, Mrs. Huyen answered. I said what I came to say. In the hallway out of Diep's hearing, Mrs. Huyen lowered her voice. Show me. James showed her the photo before it vanished. Mrs. Huyen's eyes darkened. Mr. Fat? I don't know, James whispered. Do not tell Diep yet, Mrs. Huyen said. James' head snapped up. Why? Because fear spreads faster than truth, she said. Protect their peace first, then protect their lives. He nodded, torn. Back inside, Diep stood politely at the door. Please come again. Mrs. Huyen looked at her one more time. My daughter. Lock the door at night. Not because you should be afraid, but because you should be wise. Diep nodded, unsettled. Of course. When the door closed, the home became quiet again. Diep held the bracelet like a fragile miracle. James walked to her and pulled her into his arms. Your mom. She called me her daughter, Diep whispered. You earned it, James said. For a second, Diep murmured. It felt like we can finally breathe. James closed his eyes, holding her tighter. Yes, he said. But his phone, silent now, felt like a stone in his pocket. Late afternoon, James stepped onto the balcony with his phone and dialed his mother. Mrs. Huyen answered on the second ring, as if she had been holding the phone in her hand. James, you saw it, he said. The message. I saw enough, Mrs. Huyen replied. Her voice was quiet, but it carried steel. Listen carefully. Whoever is doing this wants you to act alone. They want you to be ashamed, to be reckless, to make one wrong move. James looked back through the glass. Diep was inside wiping the counter, pretending not to watch him. Should I tell her? He asked. Mrs. Huyen paused. Not yet, she said. Not until you have something solid. Diep has been living with fear for too long. Don't pour more into her chest unless you must. James' jaw tightened. But she'll feel it anyway. She will, Mrs. Huyen admitted. So you give her safety and actions. Lock the doors. Stay close. Keep Nee inside after dark. And if you need help, you call me first. Not your pride. Not your anger. James' voice dropped. What if it's Mr. Fat? Mrs. Huyen exhaled slowly. Your father has many ways to hurt people without touching them, she said. But don't accuse him without proof. If you point at him too early, You give him the chance to turn himself into the victim. Jame closed his eyes. I hate this. I know, Mrs. Huyen said softer. But today, I chose Diep as my daughter. That means I'm choosing her safety too. You are not alone, Jame. Don't fight like you are. The rest of the day tried to pretend it was ordinary. Diep washed dishes, folded laundry, and checked on Nee more times than she needed to. Jame stayed busy on purpose, testing the lock, tightening a hinge, moving a chair a little closer to the door. Each small action looked normal, but it carried the same message. He was bracing for something. Diep watched him until she couldn't pretend anymore. You're quiet, she said. Just tired, Jame answered. She studied his face. Then tell me what kind of tired. Jame didn't give her the full truth. Not yet. He only said, if anything feels strange tonight, stay close to Nye. Diep's chest tightened. Is this about Mr. Fat? Jame's silence was an answer. He reached for her hand. I'm here, he said. I won't let anyone take what we have. Evening arrived. After dinner, Diep guided Nee into the bedroom, closed the door, and kept her voice gentle until the child settled. When Diep returned, she found Jame standing by the front door, palm near the lock. I don't want fine, Diep said. I want the truth. The truth is, Jame whispered, someone is testing me. Before Diep could ask more, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the home went dark. Nye made a sleepy sound from the bedroom. Diep moved instinctively, but Jame caught her wrist. Stay, he said. I'll check. Jame used his phone as a small light and walked to the breaker. Nothing. No trip. The streetlights outside still glowed. The darkness felt chosen. He returned to the front door and leaned in. A soft scrape. Metal against metal. Someone was working the lock from the outside. Diep's breath stopped. She backed toward the bedroom, silent and fast. She slipped inside with Nye and locked the door. Jame stepped between the front door and the hallway, placing his body where it mattered most. The scrape stopped. Then came a knock, too polite, too controlled. Tap, tap. A low voice, muffled through the wood, said one word, choose. Jame didn't answer. He held his breath until his lungs burned. Something slid through the doorframe. A thin envelope dropped onto the floor inside. Then footsteps, slow, unhurried, moved away. Minutes passed. No more knocks, no more scraping. Only the distant sound of a motorbike turning a corner. Jame picked up the envelope with careful fingers. No name, just neat, black ink. For the man who thinks he can keep them. His phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. One night, one choice. Don't involve anyone. James stared at the words until they blurred. He understood what they wanted. His isolation. If he fought alone, he would be easier to break. A moment later, the power returned. The room filled with weak yellow light, like nothing had happened. Diep stepped out of the bedroom, face pale, but steady. She looked at the envelope, then at James' eyes. Tell me, she said. James' mouth opened, then closed. Lying would be easier, but the house had already lost its innocence. Someone came to the door, he admitted. They left this. They want me to choose. Diep's voice shook. Choose what? I don't know yet, James said, and the words tasted like fear. Diep took the bracelet, still unworn, from the table and placed it into his palm. Then choose us, she whispered. Choose us with the truth. James curled his fingers around the cold metal and looked at the front door, at the lock, at the quiet street beyond. Night had come, and somewhere in that darkness, someone was waiting for his next move.
Trong tập này, Diệp rơi vào bước đường cùng khi công ty bị mua sạch đơn hàng, nợ nần và sát bờ phá sản. Ông Phát hẹn gặp, đưa 20.000 USD và một hợp đồng mua lại, xóa nợ còn dư tiền, nhưng đổi lại Diệp phải rời xa Jame. Diệp cắn răng từ chối vì cô hiểu nếu nhận tiền, tình yêu và lòng tự trọng sẽ mất. Đúng lúc lời ép buộc lên cao, ông Phát choáng váng ngã gục vì bệnh tim. Diệp không do dự, gọi xe và đưa ông vào bệnh viện kịp thời. Jame đến nơi vừa biết ơn vừa bối rối, sợ đây chỉ là cái bẫy thật. Trước cửa phòng cấp cứu, Diệp im lặng tay run, chỉ hỏi nếu hôm nay tôi cứu bác có để chúng tôi yên không?